Alarms tore through the narrow halls of the Vraxil scout vessel as Commander Cale Vorn gripped the edge of his console, watching red lights flash across the display. A single unknown ship had entered the edge of the negotiation zone without warning, its engines burning hotter than anything in the Coalition database. For 3 full seconds, nobody on the bridge moved. Then Cale barked an order, and the crew snapped into motion, weapon systems humming to life as the ship rotated to face the intruder. It was not an attack. The vessel slowed, dropped its shields, and broadcast a simple greeting in accented galactic common. It was the humans, arriving early for the very meeting Cale had been dreading for weeks. He had heard the stories, the same ones every soldier in the Coalition fleet whispered about when they thought no officers were listening. Stories about a species that had crawled out of a planet trying to kill them at every turn. A world so brutal that simply being born there counted as surviving an ambush. The other officers called them exaggerations, campfire tales, meant to scare young recruits. Cale was not so sure. He straightened his uniform and walked toward the docking bay, his second in command, Sella Rowe, falling into step beside him. She was young, sharp, and utterly unconvinced by rumor. "They are just another species," she said. "Soft, probably. Every new race thinks they are the toughest thing in the galaxy, until they meet something that actually is." Cale said nothing. He had reviewed the classified reports before this posting. Brief mentions of human colonies surviving conditions that would have wiped out 3 Coalition worlds combined. Radiation storms, predator invasions, diseases that mutated overnight, and still, the species had grown, spread, and eventually knocked on the door of galactic civilization, with a request to join, not a demand. Behind him, 2 junior officers whispered to each other, quickly falling silent when Sella shot them a warning glance. Cale understood the tension. Every soldier stationed at this outpost had grown up on stories about the Coalition's early years, when first contact with an unknown species could mean anything from lasting friendship to sudden catastrophe. Humanity was still an unknown quantity, freshly admitted to provisional status within the wider community, and provisional status meant caution at every turn. He glanced at the readiness board mounted near the docking bay entrance, confirming that defense systems remained on standby rather than active alert. Standard procedure for a diplomatic arrival, even one that had technically broken protocol by showing up ahead of schedule. Still, he found his hand drifting briefly toward the sidearm at his belt before he caught himself and let it fall back to his side. This was a meeting, not an engagement. He needed to remember that. The docking bay doors slid open with a hiss of pressurized air, and the first humans stepped through. They did not look dangerous. A woman with short brown hair led the group, her uniform crisp, her expression calm, in a way that unsettled Cale more than aggression would have. Beside her walked a tall man with sun-worn skin and quiet eyes, the kind of eyes that had clearly seen things he did not talk about. Behind them came 4 more crew members, each carrying themselves with an ease that felt almost careless in the middle of a first contact meeting between 2 starfaring civilizations. "Commander Vorn," the woman said, extending a hand in the human gesture of greeting. "I am Colonel Grace Whitfield. Thank you for meeting us." Cale studied the gesture for a moment before mimicking it, his 4-fingered hand closing carefully around hers. Her grip was firm, steady, without a trace of hesitation. "You arrived ahead of schedule," he said. "We like to be early," Grace replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "Old habit. Where we come from, being late can cost you more than time." Cello exchanged a glance with Cale, one that carried a question neither of them said aloud. What kind of world made punctuality a matter of survival? They were led through the Coalition outpost, a modest structure built into the side of a hollowed asteroid, its corridors lined with reinforced alloy and dim green lighting, meant to be comfortable for a dozen different species at once. The humans walked without complaint, adjusting easily to the lower gravity, the strange air composition, the alien architecture. Nothing seemed to bother them. At the central chamber, Coalition representatives from 3 other species waited, each seated behind their designated terminals. A Threll diplomat, all long limbs and translucent skin, watched the humans enter with open curiosity. A Connor elder, ancient and slow-moving, simply nodded in greeting, and near the back, silent and still, sat a single Vok observer, a species so rarely seen outside their home cluster that most in the room had never spoken to one directly. The meeting began formally enough. Trade agreements were discussed. Border boundaries were proposed. Communication protocols were established for future contact between fleets. Grace Whitfield spoke with confidence, her words measured and precise, never once faltering even when the Threll diplomat asked pointed questions about humanity's rapid expansion and history of conflict. "We are not going to pretend our history is peaceful," Grace said. "It is not. But we have learned. We are here because we want partnership, not conquest." The Threll diplomat seemed satisfied with the answer. Kale was less certain. There was something in the way the humans spoke about conflict, an ease that suggested it was simply a part of their daily lives, rather than something distant and abstract. As the formal discussion wound down, Grace suggested something that made the room go quiet. "In our culture, an agreement is not complete until it is shared over a meal," she said. "We would like to invite the coalition representatives aboard our vessel tonight. Nothing formal, just food." Before the elder could finish speaking, the Threll diplomat raised a thin hand, his translucent skin catching the dim light of the chamber. "A question, if I may," he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone used to weighing every word. "Your species has only recently gained provisional standing within the coalition. Many of us remain uncertain about the full scope of your history. Is there anything you feel we should understand before extending further trust?" Grace did not hesitate. "Our history includes conflict, scarcity, and loss, on a scale most of you would find difficult to imagine," she said. "We are not proud of every chapter of it, but every part of it shaped who we became. I would rather you understand that plainly now, than discover it later, and wonder why we never mentioned it." The chamber grew quiet at the honesty of the answer. Kale found himself studying Grace's expression closely, searching for the practiced calm of a diplomat delivering a rehearsed line. He found none. The words carried the weight of simple, unguarded truth. "Candor is appreciated," the Threll diplomat said finally, settling back into his seat. "Few species offer it so readily during a first formal exchange. We have found that hiding difficult truths tends to cause more trouble later," Grace replied. "Easier to be honest from the start." The Kanor elder chuckled softly, a sound like rustling leaves. "A charming custom. We accept." Kale hesitated only a moment before nodding his agreement. Sella leaned toward him as the meeting adjourned, her voice low. "This is your chance to see if the rumors are true," she said. "Or my chance to see nothing at all," Kale replied. "Perhaps it really is just food." But as they walked back toward the docking bay to prepare for the evening, Kale found himself thinking about the calm in Grace Whitfield's eyes, the ease in her crew's posture, the quiet confidence that seemed to run through every human he had met so far. It was not the posture of a fragile species playing at diplomacy. It was the posture of survivors who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He thought about the classified reports again, the mentions of human resilience that coalition scientists had struggled to fully explain. Perhaps tonight he would finally understand what made this species different. Perhaps he would learn why. Across a dozen unofficial channels, veteran officers spoke the word Deathworlder with something close to caution. Whatever waited aboard that ship, Kale Vorn intended to be ready for it. He straightened his shoulders, signaled for Sella to follow, and stepped back through the docking bay doors, unaware that nothing in his years of training had prepared him for a simple dinner invitation. The human ship, when they boarded it an hour later, smelled unlike anything in the coalition fleet. Warm, rich, faintly sharp in a way that made Kale's breathing passages tighten with unfamiliar alertness. Sella noticed it too, her antennae twitching slightly, as they were led down a narrow corridor toward what the crew called the mess hall. "That smell," she whispered. "Is it a warning system? Some kind of alert?" A young human crew member walking beside them laughed, not unkindly. "That is just dinner," he said. "Wait until you see what is on the table." Kale did not know it yet, but that simple sentence would haunt him for the rest of the evening. The mess hall doors slid open, and the smell that had been faint in the corridor became overwhelming. Kale Vorn stepped inside first, his sharp eyes scanning the room out of pure habit, cataloging exits, cataloging threats, cataloging anything that might explain the strange tightness building in his chest. The room itself was simple, long metal tables, benches instead of proper chairs. Strings of small lights hung along the ceiling, giving the space a warm glow that felt oddly inviting, despite the strangeness of everything on the tables. More crew members filled the benches than Cale had expected, perhaps a dozen in total, each one glancing up with open curiosity, rather than the guarded wariness he had anticipated. A few offered small nods of greeting. One young woman near the far wall raised a hand in an awkward wave, before quickly returning her attention to the tray in front of her, as though embarrassed by her own enthusiasm. Cale noted the easy camaraderie running through the room, the way crew members leaned across the tables to steal food from each other's plates without complaint, the loose, unguarded posture of soldiers who clearly did not expect danger to arrive during dinner. It was a stark contrast to the formal, measured atmosphere of the Coalition meeting chamber only hours earlier. Grace Whitfield stood near the head of the room, waving the Coalition guests forward with genuine warmth. Come in, she said. Sit wherever you like. We are not big on formal seating arrangements. The Canor elder settled slowly onto a bench, testing its sturdiness with obvious relief when it held his weight. The Threll diplomat perched delicately at the edge of another seat, clearly uncertain about human furniture. The Vok observer remained standing near the wall, silent as always, watching everything with unreadable dark eyes. Sela sat beside Cale, her gaze fixed on the center of the table, where several large dishes had been placed. Steam rose from a pot of something dark red, chunks of meat visible beneath a thick, glistening sauce. Beside it sat a tray of grilled strips, charred at the edges, releasing a smell so intense that Cale's throat felt like it was closing. What is that? Sela asked, pointing carefully at the pot. A crew member, a broad-shouldered man introduced earlier as Sergeant Owen Marsh, grinned as he ladled a portion onto a plate. That is a stew my grandmother used to make. Nothing fancy, just meat, beans, and a good amount of pepper. Pepper, Cale repeated slowly, as though testing the word for hidden meaning. It is a plant, Owen explained. Grows on our homeworld. Some of them are mild, some of them will make your eyes water. This batch leans toward the second kind. He set a small bowl beside the stew, filled with tiny red pieces no larger than a fingertip. To Cale, they looked harmless, decorative even, but he noticed the way several human crew members eyed the bowl with something close to respect, the way a soldier might eye a weapon they knew to be dangerous. Grace took her seat across from Cale and began serving herself without hesitation, spooning a generous portion of the stew onto her plate, before adding several of the small red pieces directly on top. You eat that without preparation? Cale asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. This is the preparation, Grace said, smiling. Would you like to try some? Every instinct in Cale's body told him to decline, but he was a commander representing an entire fleet, seated at a table meant to build trust between civilizations. Refusing the very first dish offered to him would send a message he did not intend. He nodded, and a plate was placed in front of him, a modest portion of the stew steaming gently. He lifted a small piece with the utensil provided, a simple two-pronged fork, and brought it carefully to his mouth. The reaction was immediate. Heat bloomed across his tongue, spreading rapidly, climbing into his throat, prickling behind his eyes. His breathing hitched. Every human at the table watched him with polite, curious expressions, as though waiting to see how he would respond to something entirely ordinary. That is, Cale managed, setting down his fork with as much dignity as he could muster. That is quite intense. Owen laughed, not unkindly. That is a mild batch, honestly. My aunt makes one that could probably strip paint. Sela, watching her commander's obvious discomfort, decided against trying the stew, and instead reached for a plain-looking piece of bread resting on a smaller plate nearby. She bit into it cautiously, relieved to find it soft, warm, and free of anything resembling the fire that had clearly ambushed Cale. Across the table, the Threll diplomat attempted a small portion of the grilled meat strips and immediately reached for a cup of water, drinking deeply as the human crew exchanged amused glances that were careful not to become outright laughter. You get used to it, Grace said gently, noticing the diplomat's watering eyes. Some of our crew grew up eating food like this every day. It does not bother them the way it bothers newcomers. Every day? the Connor elder asked, his voice carrying genuine astonishment. This is not a special occasion meal. This is a Tuesday, Owen said with a shrug, spooning more stew onto his own plate. Nothing special about it. On some settlements, the peppers are practically a currency, Lily added, reaching for a piece of bread. You trade a jar of the good stuff for almost anything. Extra shifts off, a favor, a decent bottle of something to drink. People take their spice seriously. A currency, Sella repeated, still eyeing the small red bowl as though it might strike at her without warning. Based on something that causes physical distress. Depends who you ask, Owen said, grinning. Some of us stopped calling it distress a long time ago. It is more like waking up, keeps you sharp. The Connor elder studied the bowl with newfound caution, clearly reconsidering whether he wished to sample it at all. I believe I will observe for now, he said carefully, earning a round of good-natured laughter from the nearby crew. Smart move, Owen said. Took me years to work my way up to the stronger batches. No shame in starting slow. Cale reached for the cup of dark liquid sitting beside his plate, hoping it might ease the burning sensation still lingering in his mouth. He took a long sip, only to discover the liquid was bitter, almost sharp in its own way, nothing like the cooling relief he had expected. What is this? He asked, staring at the cup. Coffee, Grace answered. It will not help with the spice, honestly. Some people say it makes it worse. Then why offer it? Habit, mostly, she said, taking a long drink from her own cup without any visible reaction. Most of us cannot function properly in the morning without it. Cale set the cup down and studied the room more carefully now, looking past the initial shock of the meal itself. He noticed the scars along Owen's forearms, thin white lines that spoke of old injuries long healed. He noticed the way another crew member, a woman introduced as Ensign Lily Bennett, ate one-handed, while the other rested near what looked like a small emergency medical kit clipped to her belt, a habit so automatic she likely did not even realize she was doing it. He noticed, most of all, the complete absence of concern on any human face at the table. To them, this meal, this fire disguised as food, this bitter drink meant to keep them functioning, all of it was simply ordinary, unremarkable. Background noise in lives that had clearly known far greater difficulties. Commander Vorn, Grace said, drawing his attention back to her. You seem troubled. I am simply observing, Cale replied carefully. Your species treats hardship differently than we expected. Grace considered this for a moment, setting down her fork. Where we come from, difficulty is not something unusual. It is just part of life. Storms, sickness, long winters with barely enough food. You learn to keep moving forward, or you do not survive long enough to complain about it. And the pepper? Sella asked, still eyeing the small red bowl with clear suspicion. Grace laughed softly. The pepper is just for fun, honestly. Life gives us enough real challenges. Might as well enjoy a little extra heat with dinner. The meal continued, course after course arriving with the same casual confidence. A dish of dark leafy greens cooked with more of the fiery red pieces. A tray of small round vegetables roasted until their skins blistered. A dessert, finally, something sweet and warm that offered the coalition guests their first genuine relief of the evening. Throughout it all, Cale watched, listened, and slowly began to understand something the classified reports had never quite managed to capture. This was not bravado. This was not a performance meant to impress visiting dignitaries. This was simply how humans lived, day after day, without a second thought. As the meal wound toward its end, Owen Marsh leaned back on the bench, patting his stomach with obvious satisfaction. Not bad for a first contact dinner, he said, grinning at Cale. Wait until you try the good stuff. Cale blinked. This was not the good stuff? This was the beginner version, Owen said, exchanging a knowing look with Lily Bennett across the table. We toned it down for guests. Grace noticed the exchange and smiled, turning her attention to Cale. Do not let him worry you too much, she said. There is a wide range between tonight's meal and what Owen considers the good stuff. Most of what we cook day to day sits somewhere comfortably in the middle. And where does tonight fall on that range? Cale asked. Toward the gentle end, Grace admitted. We wanted our guests to enjoy the evening, not spend it recovering. I appreciate the consideration, Cale said, though a part of him could not help wondering what the far end of that range might actually involve. Lily leaned over, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. "For what it's worth, Commander, you handled it better than most first-timers do. Ensign Bramwell over there needed 3 cups of water his first time trying the mild batch." Cole, seated further down the table, groaned audibly at the memory. "That was one time," he said, "and nobody warned me it would build up the longer I chewed." "We told you exactly that," Owen said, laughing. "You just did not believe us." The gentle teasing continued for a while longer, the human crew clearly enjoying the chance to share stories with their new guests, before the conversation eventually settled and the final trays were cleared from the table. Cale Vorn said nothing, but somewhere beneath his composed exterior, a quiet unease began to settle in. If this had been the gentle version, prepared specifically to accommodate outsiders, he found himself deeply uncertain about what the true version might involve. Sella caught his eye from across the table, her expression mirroring his own growing concern. Neither of them spoke the thought aloud, but it hung in the air between them nonetheless. They had come here expecting to evaluate a newly discovered species for the Coalition Council. Instead, they were beginning to suspect they had greatly underestimated exactly what that evaluation might reveal. The dishes were cleared away, but the gathering did not end. Grace Whitfield gestured toward a lounge area adjoining the mess hall, a smaller space with low seating and dimmer lighting, where the conversation could continue without the formality of the dinner table. "We usually stay and talk for a while after a meal," she explained, "especially with guests. Feel free to relax." Cale Vorn followed cautiously, still feeling the faint burn lingering at the back of his throat. Sella walked close beside him, her earlier confidence noticeably shaken. The Connor elder settled into one of the low chairs with a contented sigh, while the Threll diplomat remained standing, still recovering from the earlier meal. The Vok observer took up a position near the doorway, silent as ever. Owen Marsh dropped onto a bench with the ease of someone completely unbothered by the evening's events, stretching his arms behind his head. "So," he said, glancing toward Cale. "First contact dinners are always a bit much. You get used to it." "You keep saying that," Cale replied, as though discomfort is simply something to become accustomed to. Grace took a seat nearby, folding her hands loosely in her lap. "I know it must seem strange from the outside," she said, "but think of it this way. Every species adapts to whatever environment shapes it. Ours simply happened to be a demanding one." "Demanding seems an understatement, based on what we witnessed tonight," Cale said. "Fair," Grace admitted with a small laugh. "We have had a long time to get comfortable with that word, though. Long enough that it stopped feeling unusual." Sella shifted forward slightly, unable to hold back her curiosity any longer. "How long exactly has your species faced these conditions?" "Recorded history goes back a fairly long way," Grace said. "Long enough that resilience became something closer to instinct than choice. Somewhere along the way, we stopped treating hardship as an obstacle and started treating it as simply the terrain we operate on." "Isn't it?" Lily Bennett asked, settling onto the arm of a nearby chair. "Discomfort is just information. It tells you something is happening. Doesn't mean you stop." Sella tilted her head, her antennae twitching with obvious curiosity now overtaking her earlier caution. "Tell me something," she said. "Is this normal for your species? This casual attitude toward hardship?" Owen exchanged a glance with Grace, who gave a small nod, as though granting permission for the conversation to continue. "I grew up on one of the outer settlements," Owen began. "Rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and wildlife that did not particularly care whether we were there or not. When I was young, maybe 12, a group of us got caught out during a training exercise when a storm rolled in early. Communications went down. Supplies ran short. We ended up surviving on whatever we could find for almost a week before rescue reached us." "A week without proper supplies," the Canner elder repeated slowly. "At 12 years of age." "We were fine," Owen said, shrugging, as though describing a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine ordeal. "Cold, hungry, tired, sure, but fine. It happens." Cale studied the man's face for any sign of exaggeration, and found none. The memory clearly did not carry the weight of trauma for Owen. It was simply a story, told the way another species might describe a mildly inconvenient delay in travel plans. Lily leaned forward, adding her own account without needing to be prompted. My unit did survival training in a region with almost no fresh water, she said. We had to purify what we found, using basic filtration methods, sometimes nothing more than cloth and patience. Made you appreciate a proper meal when you finally got back to base. And this training? Sella asked carefully. Is this something all of your soldiers experience? Most of them, Grace confirmed. It builds resilience, teaches you to keep functioning even when conditions are far from ideal. The Threll diplomat, still pale from the earlier meal, finally spoke up, his voice carrying genuine unease. Where we come from, such conditions would be considered a crisis, requiring immediate intervention. You describe them as routine training. Everyone's normal is different, Grace said simply. Our planet did not offer many gentle options. We adapted. The conversation shifted from stories of hardship to something that unsettled Kale even further, a series of casual mentions scattered throughout the discussion that painted an increasingly vivid picture of the world these humans called home. Predators large enough to threaten entire settlements, hunted not with advanced technology, but with careful strategy and cooperation. Diseases that had once devastated populations, before humanity developed the means to fight back. Environmental disasters, storms and quakes and floods, treated not as rare catastrophes but as expected seasonal events requiring preparation, rather than panic. Your planet sounds, Sella searched for the right word, unable to find anything adequate. Difficult. It has its moments, Owen said with a small laugh. But it made us who we are. You do not really appreciate calm until you have lived through the alternative. A stocky, older man near the corner of the room, introduced as Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Ashby, cleared his throat before offering his own contribution to the growing collection of stories. I served on a rescue team for a number of years, he said. Coastal region back home, prone to sudden flooding. We would get called out at all hours, sometimes into conditions that made visibility almost non-existent, water moving fast enough to sweep a person off their feet without warning. That sounds like a role reserved for the most experienced among you, Kale said. Plenty of us were barely out of training, Daniel replied. You learn quickly in that line of work, or you find another line of work. Lost a few good people over the years, kept going anyway. Somebody has to. How does a species continue functioning after such losses? The Threll diplomat asked quietly, his earlier discomfort from the meal now replaced by genuine, somber curiosity. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering. You grieve, he said simply. Then you get back up, because the next flood does not wait for you to finish grieving before it arrives. It sounds harsh, put that way. It did not always feel harsh from the inside. It just felt necessary. The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of the statement settling over coalition and human guests alike. Grace broke the silence gently, resting a hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder. We do not share these stories to impress anyone, she said, addressing the coalition delegation directly. We share them because they are simply part of who we are. I would rather you understand the full picture than only the parts that are easy to hear. A quiet young man near the back of the room, introduced only briefly as Ensign Cole Bramwell, spoke up for the first time that evening. I used to think everyone lived like we did, he admitted. Learning about other species who grew up without needing to worry about predators or disasters or scarcity, that was strange to hear about. Almost hard to imagine. You mean easier lives, the Kanor elder offered gently. I suppose, Cole said, considering the word carefully. Different, at least. Kale found himself watching Cole with particular interest. Unlike Owen and Lily, whose confidence seemed forged through years of hardened experience, Cole carried a quieter, more thoughtful presence. Yet even he spoke of danger and difficulty, with the same casual acceptance that ran through every human in the room. May I ask something direct? Kale said finally, addressing Grace. Of course. Does your species experience fear? The question landed heavier than he intended, and for a moment the room fell quiet. Grace considered it seriously before answering. Of course we do, she said. Fear kept our ancestors alive long enough to become who we are today. But fear and hesitation are not the same thing. We learned early that stopping to be afraid rarely solved anything. Better to keep moving, keep adapting, and process the fear once the immediate problem was handled. That is a remarkably practical way to describe survival, Kale said quietly. It had to be, Grace replied. Our world did not leave much room for anything else. The Vok observer, silent throughout the entire evening, finally shifted from the doorway and spoke for the first time, its voice low and resonant. This is why the Coalition has been cautious in its approach to your species, it said. Resilience of this magnitude is rare. It raises questions about capability that extend beyond simple survival. Grace met the Vok's gaze evenly. We are not looking to prove anything to the Coalition, she said. We simply want a place in the wider community. Our history is not one we are proud of in every regard, but it made us capable of enduring far more than most would expect. May I ask a question of my own? Grace said, glancing toward Kale and Sela. What does fear look like among your people? Sela considered the question carefully. Among the Vraxil, fear is treated as a signal to withdraw and reassess, she said. We are trained to recognize it early and respond with caution rather than continued engagement. That sounds sensible, Grace said. It has kept our people alive for a long time, Kale added. Though I confess, after tonight, I wonder whether caution alone would have been enough to survive your homeworld. Grace smiled faintly at that, without a trace of pride in her expression. Caution has its place with us too, she said. We simply learned that withdrawal was not always an option. Sometimes the only path forward was through the difficulty itself. The conversation continued for some time, drifting between lighter topics and moments of startling revelation. Sela found herself asking increasingly detailed questions, her earlier skepticism replaced by a mixture of fascination and something close to concern. Kale, meanwhile, grew quieter as the evening progressed, absorbing each new detail with the growing understanding that everything he had read in the classified reports had, if anything, understated the reality. At one point, Owen rolled up his sleeve to show a long, faded scar running from wrist to elbow, the result, he explained casually, of an encounter with wildlife during a supply run gone wrong. He described the incident with the same tone someone might use to describe a minor traffic delay. No trace of the fear or trauma Kale would have expected from such an experience. Did it require extensive medical treatment? Kale asked. Some stitches, a few weeks of limited movement, Owen said. Nothing that kept me out of duty for long. And you returned to the same type of assignment afterward? Had to, Owen said simply. Someone needed to keep the supply lines running. Can't let one bad encounter stop the whole operation. Lily nodded in agreement, adding her own perspective. That is just how it works. You get hurt, you heal, you get back to it. Standing still helps no one. Kale found himself struck by the sheer consistency of this attitude across every human he had spoken to that evening. It was not isolated bravado from a handful of particularly hardened individuals. It appeared to be a fundamental trait shared across the entire species, woven so deeply into their culture that none of them seemed to recognize how extraordinary it actually was. As the gathering finally began to wind down, Grace stood and addressed the Coalition guests one final time. Thank you for joining us tonight, she said warmly. I know our customs might seem unusual, but I hope this gave you a better understanding of who we are. It gave us a great deal to consider, Kale said carefully. As the Coalition delegation prepared to depart, Owen offered one final comment, delivered with the same easy grin he had worn throughout the entire evening. Next time you visit, we will have to introduce you to real training rations, he said. Compared to those, tonight's dinner was practically a delicacy. Sela's antennae stiffened visibly at the comment, and even Kale, who had maintained careful composure throughout the evening, felt a fresh wave of unease settle over him. As they made their way back toward the docking bay, passing again through corridors filled with that same warm, sharp smell that had first unsettled them upon arrival, Sela finally broke the silence between them. Commander, she said quietly, I do not think the rumors were exaggerated at all. Kale said nothing for a long moment, replaying the evening's conversations in his mind, the casual scars, the offhand stories of survival, the complete absence of fear in the face of hardships that would have devastated most Coalition species entirely. No, he finally agreed. I believe they understated the truth considerably. Behind them, the human ship's lights glowed steadily against the darkness of space, warm and inviting, utterly unaware of the quiet unease it had left behind in its coalition guests. For Cale Vorn, the evening had answered one question, while raising a dozen new ones. He had come here to determine whether humanity might pose a threat to galactic stability. He was beginning to suspect the true danger lay not in what humans might choose to do, but in what they had already proven capable of enduring without so much as a second thought. 3 days later, the coalition delegation returned to the human vessel for a follow-up meeting, this time to finalize the details of a proposed trade agreement. Cale Vorn walked the corridors with a different kind of attention now, no longer simply cataloging exits and threats, but studying the humans themselves, searching for any crack in the composure he had witnessed during the dinner. He found none. If anything, the crew seemed even more relaxed in their second meeting, greeting the coalition guests with familiar warmth, rather than the careful politeness of first contact. Sela had spent the days between visits reviewing every scrap of data the coalition possessed on human physiology, searching for some scientific explanation that might make the previous dinner feel less unsettling in hindsight. She found frustratingly little. Human tolerance thresholds, whether for pain, temperature, or exertion, sat consistently higher than coalition baseline models predicted, yet nothing in their biology suggested any unusual adaptation beyond what could be explained by generations of harsh environmental pressure. It was, she had concluded, simply the result of an entire species being forged by difficulty rather than shielded from it. She shared this assessment with Cale as they walked toward the meeting chamber, and he nodded slowly, filing the information away, alongside everything else he had learned. It did nothing to ease the quiet unease that had settled over him since the dinner, but it did help him understand, at least in part, why the humans carried themselves the way they did. The meeting had progressed for nearly an hour, discussions moving smoothly between trade routes and resource allocation, when a sharp alarm suddenly cut through the room. Red light flooded the corridor outside the meeting chamber, and a calm mechanical voice announced a containment breach in one of the lower storage sections. Sela's antennae shot upright immediately, her entire body tensing at the sound. The Threll diplomat rose from his seat so quickly he nearly toppled it. Even Cale, trained for decades to remain composed under pressure, felt his pulse quicken sharply. Grace Whitfield did not so much as flinch. "Containment breach," she said calmly, glancing at a small device on her wrist. "Storage Section 4. That would be the coolant lines. Should we evacuate?" Sela asked, already moving toward the door. "No need," Grace said, standing at a measured pace and gesturing for the coalition guests to remain seated. "Owen's team handles this kind of thing regularly. Give it a moment." As if summoned by her words, Owen Marsh's voice crackled through a nearby communication panel, his tone carrying no urgency whatsoever. "Minor coolant leak. Section 4. Cleanup in progress. No injuries. Continue as normal." The alarm cut off a moment later, the red lighting returning to its usual soft glow. Grace resumed her seat, as though nothing had happened at all, picking up the conversation exactly where it had left off. Cale stared at her, momentarily unable to focus on the trade discussion. "That did not concern you at all," he said. "Should it have?" Grace asked, genuinely curious about the question. "A containment breach," Cale said slowly, "aboard a starship, involving hazardous materials." "A minor one," Grace corrected gently. "We deal with dozens of small system failures every month. Ships are complicated machines. Things go wrong. You fix them and move on." "And if it had been serious?" Grace considered the question for a moment. "Then we would have handled that too," she said simply. "Panicking rarely fixes a leak." The meeting continued, but Cale found his attention repeatedly drawn back to the moment of the alarm, replaying the complete absence of fear in Grace's reaction, the immediate, practiced calm of her crew's response. It was not bravado. It was not performance for the benefit of watching guests. It was simply how these people operated when faced with danger, however minor or severe. Later that day, as the coalition delegation toured a section of the ship dedicated to crew training, they witnessed something that solidified the growing unease into something closer to genuine alarm. In a wide-open training area, several human crew members were engaged in what Grace described as a standard physical conditioning exercise. Lily Bennett stood at the center of a sparring ring, facing off against a much larger crew member Cale had not yet met, a broad-shouldered woman introduced simply as Nora Whitcomb. The two moved with startling speed, exchanging controlled strikes and holds, each impact landing with enough force to make Sella flinch beside him. Yet neither woman showed any sign of distress. When Nora landed a particularly solid hit against Lily's shoulder, sending her stumbling backward, Lily simply laughed, shook out her arm, and reset her stance. "This is training?" the Canor elder asked, his voice tight with concern. "They are causing each other harm." "Controlled contact," Grace explained. "It teaches you to keep functioning even when you take a hit. Real conflict rarely gives you the option to stop and recover." "And this does not cause lasting injury?" Sella asked. "Sometimes bruises," Grace admitted. "Occasionally something more serious. But that is what medical staff are for. You cannot train for hardship without accepting a little discomfort along the way." The sparring continued for several more minutes before Lily finally caught Nora in a controlled hold, ending the exercise. Both women stepped back, breathing heavily, but grinning at each other with obvious mutual respect, as though the entire exchange had been nothing more than an enjoyable game. Sella found herself stepping closer to the edge of the ring, studying the faint bruising already forming along Lily's forearm, with a mixture of concern and fascination. "Does this not worry your medical staff?" she asked. "Deliberately causing injury during routine exercise." "Priya keeps an eye on us," Nora said, catching her breath. "There is a difference between training hard and training recklessly. We push each other, but nobody wants to end up genuinely sidelined over a sparring match. That would defeat the purpose."
"And the purpose is?"
Sella pressed. "To make sure that if something worse happens out there," Nora said, gesturing vaguely toward the stars beyond the training room's viewport. "We have already felt something like it before. Better to meet a real problem with familiar instincts than to freeze, because it is the first time your body has ever taken a hit." Cale considered this explanation carefully, turning it over against everything else he had witnessed that day. It was not cruelty, nor recklessness. It was preparation, deliberate and methodical, aimed at ensuring that no crisis would catch these people entirely unprepared. "That was a good one," Nora said, rubbing her shoulder, where Lily had landed a solid strike earlier. "You have gotten faster." "Comes from all that morning conditioning," Lily replied, still catching her breath. "Rematch next week?" "Wouldn't miss it." Cale watched the exchange with a growing sense of disbelief. These were not soldiers preparing reluctantly for necessary combat. These were people who seemed to genuinely enjoy testing the limits of their own endurance, treating physical hardship as something closer to sport than survival. As the tour continued, Owen joined the group, still faintly smelling of whatever had caused the earlier coolant leak, his hands slightly stained but his demeanor entirely unbothered. "Enjoying the tour?" he asked cheerfully. "It has been quite illuminating," Cale said carefully. "Wait until you see the medical bay," Owen said. "Dr. Ferris has some stories that would make your antennae curl right off." Sella's antennae, already standing at full alert, seemed to twitch involuntarily at the comment. Before reaching the medical bay, the group passed through a common area, where several off-duty crew members lounged between shifts. One young man sat with his leg propped up on a low bench, a thin brace wrapped around his ankle, calmly reading from a data pad as though nothing were wrong at all. "Twisted it during drills yesterday," he explained cheerfully, when he noticed the coalition guests watching him. "Dr. Ferris says another day or two, and I will be back on full duty." "You do not appear troubled by the injury," Cale observed. "No point being troubled," the young man said with a shrug. "It happened. It is healing, and complaining about it will not make it heal any faster." Owen chuckled at the exchange, gesturing for the group to continue onward. "You will hear some version of that phrase from just about everyone aboard," he said. "Complaining does not fix a leak. Complaining does not heal a sprain. We save our energy for things that actually help." The medical bay, when they arrived, proved to be exactly as unsettling as Owen had promised. A tall woman with graying hair, introduced as Dr. Priya Ferris, greeted the delegation with brisk efficiency, gesturing toward a wall lined with equipment Cale did not recognize. "Standard field trauma kit," she explained when Cale asked. "We keep enough supplies aboard to handle everything from minor cuts to major internal injuries, without needing to divert to a full medical facility." "You anticipate injuries of that severity as a regular occurrence?" Cale asked. We prepare for the worst and hope for the best, Priya said with a small shrug. Better to have supplies you never need than to need supplies you do not have. She walked them through a brief overview of the ship's medical capabilities, describing procedures and treatments with the same casual confidence Kale had come to recognize as a defining trait of the entire species. When Sela asked, somewhat hesitantly, how often the medical bay saw actual use, Priya laughed, not unkindly. More than you would probably guess, she said. Between training injuries, equipment malfunctions, and the occasional away mission gone sideways, we stay fairly busy. Nothing we cannot handle, though. As the tour concluded and the coalition delegation made their way back toward the docking bay, Kale found himself walking in near silence, his mind working through everything he had witnessed over the past several hours. The casual response to a hazardous breach, the willingness to inflict and absorb physical harm during routine training, the calm acceptance of a medical bay stocked for regular serious injury. None of it aligned with anything in the Coalition's prior understanding of a species suitable for peaceful integration. And yet, none of it suggested aggression either. If anything, it painted a picture of a species so thoroughly accustomed to hardship that danger itself had become simply another part of daily operations, neither feared nor sought out, but accepted without hesitation. Sela broke the silence as they reached the docking bay, her voice carrying a note of genuine unease Kale had rarely heard from her before. "Commander," she said, "I do not think we fully understand what we are dealing with." Kale nodded slowly, watching as Grace Whitfield offered a final farewell from the far end of the corridor, her expression warm and entirely unaware of the storm of concern she had left behind in her coalition guests. "No," he agreed quietly, "I do not think we do either." As the coalition shuttle pulled away from the human vessel, Kale found himself staring back at the glowing lights of the ship, turning over the events of the day in his mind. Somewhere in the back of his thoughts, a single realization settled with quiet certainty. They had come here to evaluate whether humanity might pose a danger to the wider galaxy. They were leaving with an entirely different question, one far more difficult to answer. What exactly had shaped a species capable of treating danger, injury, and hardship with such complete and unshaken calm? And more importantly, what would happen the day that calm was finally tested by something the humans themselves considered serious? The Coalition Council chamber buzzed with tension long before Kale Vorn arrived to deliver his report. Word had already spread through unofficial channels. Fragments of the story passed between officers until it had grown into something closer to legend. A species that treated pain as background noise. A species that trained its soldiers with real strikes and real consequences. A species that kept its medical bays stocked for regular serious injury and considered it nothing more than practical planning. Kale stood before the assembled council, representatives from a dozen member species watching him with varying degrees of skepticism and concern. He kept his account precise and factual, describing the dinner, the training demonstration, the casual response to the coolant breach, careful to avoid exaggeration, even as several council members leaned forward with growing alarm. "You are telling us," the presiding Threll counselor said slowly, "that this species considers such conditions ordinary, not exceptional, not the result of extraordinary training, simply normal." "That is my assessment," Kale confirmed. "Their homeworld appears to have shaped an entire culture around enduring hardship without hesitation. It is not performance. It is not exaggeration for our benefit. It is simply how they exist." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Kanor elder, who had accompanied Kale on both visits, rose to offer his own account, corroborating every detail with quiet, measured words that carried far more weight than dramatic testimony ever could have. "I have lived many years," the elder said. "I have negotiated with a great many species across this galaxy. I have never encountered anything quite like this. They do not boast about their resilience. They barely seem to notice it in themselves. That, I believe, is what should concern us most." The Vok observer, silent through most of the proceedings, finally offered a brief statement that settled over the chamber with particular weight. "A species that does not recognize its own extraordinary nature is far more difficult to predict than one that does," it said. "We recommend continued diplomatic engagement, conducted with appropriate caution." A representative from a smaller member world, a quiet species known as the Orloon who rarely spoke during council sessions, raised a hesitant hand partway through the debate. "If I may," the delegate said, "I would like to ask what danger, specifically, we believe this resilience poses. Endurance is not the same as hostility. Many species within this coalition have faced hardship of their own. We simply have not faced quite so much of it." "The concern," the Threll counselor replied, "is not that humanity intends harm. It is that a species capable of enduring so much may prove difficult to deter should relations sour in the future. Standard coalition deterrence models assume a baseline tolerance for risk and discomfort. Humanity appears to exceed that baseline considerably." "Then perhaps," the Orloon delegate offered quietly, "our deterrence models require revision, rather than our approach to humanity." The comment drew a thoughtful silence from several council members, and Cale found himself nodding slightly at the observation, though he kept his agreement private for the moment. It was a fair point, one that echoed the sentiment already forming in his own mind since that first, fiery dinner aboard the human vessel. The council debated for hours, weighing the implications of everything Cale and his companions had witnessed. Some argued for immediate restriction of human access to coalition space, citing concerns about unpredictable capability. Others argued the opposite, pointing out that humanity had approached first contact with consistent goodwill, no aggression, and a clear desire for peaceful partnership rather than conquest. In the end, the council reached a cautious compromise. Diplomatic relations with humanity would continue, trade agreements would be honored, but coalition military command would be briefed on the newly gathered intelligence, and monitoring protocols would be quietly increased across human-occupied space. Cale left the council chamber that evening feeling neither triumphant nor relieved. The report had been filed, the warnings delivered, but a nagging uncertainty remained. He had spent 2 days aboard a human vessel, sharing meals and conversation with people who had shown him nothing but warmth and hospitality. And yet everything about their culture suggested a resilience so profound it defied easy categorization. Sela found him later that night in the observation deck, staring out at the distant lights of the human colony visible through the viewport. "The council seems satisfied with the outcome," she said, settling beside him. "For now," Cale replied. "I suspect this will not be the last time we discuss the Deathworlders in that chamber." "Do you regret the visit?" Sela asked. Cale considered the question carefully before answering. "No," he said finally. "I understand them better now than I did before. That understanding simply raises more questions than it answers." A month after the council session, Cale accepted an invitation to visit the surface of the human colony itself, a gesture Grace Whitfield extended as part of the deepening diplomatic relationship. He arrived expecting something resembling the ship, contained and controlled, and instead found a sprawling settlement built directly into a landscape that still bore visible signs of hardship. Reinforced structures designed to withstand seasonal storms. Wide open fields where children ran and played within sight of tall perimeter fencing meant to keep out local wildlife. A quiet, constant hum of generators working to keep the settlement powered through conditions Cale suspected were still far from gentle. Grace walked him through the main square, greeting neighbors and colleagues by name, her demeanor no different on the ground than it had been aboard her ship. "This is home," she said simply, gesturing toward the modest buildings surrounding them. "Not glamorous, maybe, by coalition standards. But it is ours, and we built every part of it ourselves." Cale studied the settlement carefully, noting the calluses on the hands of passing workers, the practiced ease with which children navigated uneven terrain that would have troubled coalition youth of similar age. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same quiet resilience he had witnessed aboard the ship, woven into the very foundation of daily life. "It is remarkable," he said finally. "I do not think I fully appreciated the scope of what your species has built until seeing it firsthand." "We do not always appreciate it either," Grace admitted. "Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to notice what has simply become normal to us." Weeks passed, and life within the coalition continued much as it had before, trade routes expanding, diplomatic ties strengthening, the initial shock of that first dinner gradually settling into something closer to cautious respect. Word of the encounter spread far beyond the council chamber, whispered among officers across a dozen different fleets, each retelling adding new details, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, until the story had transformed into something approaching myth. Aboard the human colony ship, life continued in much the same rhythm it always had. Grace Whitfield oversaw ongoing negotiations with coalition representatives, unaware of the quiet unease her hospitality had sparked across the wider galaxy. Owen Marsh continued his maintenance duties, occasionally regaling newer crew members with stories of that memorable first dinner with the coalition delegates, laughing at the memory of Cale Vaughn's watering eyes after his first bite of stew. It was during one such retelling, several months later, that Lily Bennett made an observation that would eventually find its way back to Cale Vaughn through informal diplomatic channels, passed along with no small amount of amusement. "You know," she said, leaning back against a counter in the mess hall, "I do not think they realized we toned everything down for them." "Toned down?" a newer crew member asked, genuinely curious. "The spice." "Sure," Owen said, grinning, "but also everything else." The training demonstration was a light session. Priya's medical stories barely scratched the surface. We were being polite. "Guess it worked," Lily said with a small laugh. Grace mentioned the coalition has been unusually accommodating in recent negotiations. A little extra respect never hurts diplomacy. Word of this conversation eventually reached Cale Vaughn through a coalition intelligence officer stationed near human territory, delivered with a note of dry amusement that Cale did not entirely share. He sat with the report for a long while, considering its implications. They had not witnessed the full truth of human resilience at all. What he had experienced, the fiery meal, the casual coolant breach, the sparring demonstration, had all been a gentle introduction, carefully curated to ease coalition guests into an understanding of human culture without overwhelming them entirely. The thought settled over him with quiet unease, though not the sharp alarm he might have expected. Instead, he found himself experiencing something closer to reluctant admiration. A species capable of such restraint, capable of tempering their own extraordinary resilience out of consideration for their guests, was not a species driven by aggression or conquest. It was a species that understood strength did not need to be proven through intimidation. Sella, upon hearing the same report, offered her own perspective during a quiet conversation in the officers' quarters. "Perhaps that is the true lesson here," she said. "Not that they are dangerous, but that they choose restraint, even when they have no obligation to do so." Cale found himself agreeing, though the memory of that first bite of fiery stew still occasionally returned to him at unexpected moments, a small but persistent reminder of just how differently humanity experienced the world. Months later, during a formal coalition gathering celebrating the continued success of human diplomatic relations, Cale found himself once again seated near Grace Whitfield, the two of them sharing a quieter corner of the reception away from the larger crowd. "I heard a rumor," Cale said carefully, "that our first dinner together was significantly toned down for our benefit." Grace smiled, not entirely surprised by the observation. "We did not want to overwhelm you," she admitted. "First impressions matter. We figured easing you into things made more sense than diving straight into everything at once." "And if you had not eased us into things?" Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than boastful. "I think you would have needed considerably more time to recover," she said simply. Cale found himself almost laughing at the honesty of the response, a reaction that would have seemed impossible to him during that first tense evening, months earlier. "Perhaps someday," he said, "you might show us the true version." Grace raised her cup in a small toast, her eyes carrying a glint of genuine warmth. "Only if you think you are ready for it, Commander." Across the reception hall, Owen Marsh caught the exchange from a distance and offered Cale a knowing grin, raising his own glass in a silent, friendly challenge. Sella, standing nearby, simply shook her head, her antennae twitching with something that might have been amusement or lingering caution, perhaps a mixture of both. Later that night, as the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Cale found himself standing beside the Canor Elder, near a wide viewport overlooking the stars. The old diplomat had grown quiet over the course of the evening, watching the humans mingle with coalition representatives from a dozen different worlds, with an ease that still seemed to surprise him. "Do you remember," the elder said, "how nervous we all were before that first dinner?" "Vividly," Cale admitted. I have negotiated with new species for longer than either of us care to count, the elder continued. Most first encounters follow a familiar pattern. Caution, followed by either conflict or comfortable distance. This has been different. How so? Kale asked. They did not ask us to fear them, the elder said. They did not ask us to admire them either. They simply showed us who they are, without apology and without performance, and left us to decide what to make of it. He paused, watching Owen Marsh across the room, laughing easily with a group of Threll officers who had, only months earlier, regarded humanity with open suspicion. I believe that honesty will serve them well in this galaxy, Commander. Perhaps better than strength alone ever could. Kale found himself nodding slowly, watching the same scene unfold before him. Whatever fear that first dinner had planted in him all those months ago, it had grown into something far more complicated and far more hopeful than he ever could have predicted that night. The evening continued, filled with quiet conversation and cautious optimism about the future of coalition and human relations. Yet as Kale Vorn stood among representatives from a dozen different worlds, sharing space with a species capable of enduring hardship most could barely imagine, while still choosing warmth and hospitality over intimidation, he understood that the story of that first dinner would likely follow humanity across the galaxy for a very long time. Not as a tale of fear, though it had certainly begun that way, but as a quiet, persistent reminder that the galaxy's newest members carried strength forged not through conquest or ambition, but through simple, relentless survival, tempered always with a surprising degree of grace. And somewhere among the coalition fleets, in mess halls and briefing rooms across a dozen different worlds, officers would continue to trade the same quiet warning whenever the subject of humanity arose in conversation. They may offer you a meal with a smile, accept it carefully, and never, under any circumstances, assume that what they show you is the whole truth of who they are.